Thank you to the Association of Certified Gaming Compliance Specialists for the opportunity to be part of this fantastic initiative. This training is meant as an introduction to human trafficking in Canada and will hopefully illuminate how this crime intersects with both the gaming and hospitality sectors. A very special thank you to the lived experience expert who assisted with the content development and review process to ensure that this training was person-centered, trauma-informed, and reflective of the realities of trafficking in Canada today. We are incredibly grateful to have been able to include their critical insights as part of this project. Before we begin, please note that this training does focus on a very difficult subject. However, it is meant to be educational in nature without being sensational. Please take care while listening and feel free to step away if you need a moment to process. If you are in need of support, the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-833-900-1010. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge that while this is a virtual training, the land on which I am recording this session is the traditional home of many nations, including the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. I'm thankful to be able to work in partnership and live on the land, and really grateful to the many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people who have cared for this territory since time immemorial, and who continue to contribute to the strengthening of all communities across Turtle Island. Land acknowledgements are a traditional way that First Peoples recognize the other nations which they were visiting. And today, acknowledging traditional Indigenous territories is one way to recognize both the historical and contemporary Indigenous presence and land rights. It is just one small step that we can take towards dismantling the ongoing impact of colonialism and oppression of Indigenous people in Canada and move closer towards reconciliation. I encourage you to do your own reading and learn about the traditional land on which you currently reside or work, which nations recorded or unrecorded have taken care of the land, and which treaties apply to the land on which you're situated, and critically reflect on your own relationship to the land. My name is Ashley. I'm the Director of Stakeholder Relations at the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, and I will be leading you through this session. But before we jump into outcomes for the training, I want to start with a poignant quote from the former US President Barack Obama, who said of human trafficking, "It ought to concern every person because it is a debasement of our common humanity. It ought to concern every community because it tears at our social fabric. It ought to concern every business because it distorts markets, and it ought to concern every nation because it endangers public health and fuels violence and organized crime." This training will be broken down into 6 parts, and at the end, you'll be better able to define human trafficking and understand the differences between sex and labor trafficking and how they happen here in Canada. You'll also be better equipped to understand how trafficking activity intersects with the gaming and hospitality sector in Canada. You'll have some concrete red flag indicators to be mindful of, and finally, some tools and resources that you can take back to your workplace and also back to your community. And while you may be taking this for training, for work-related purposes, you're also a member of your community. And so it's important to remember that human trafficking is happening in all of our communities, and each one of us has the opportunity to be part of the solution. I really hope you're able to have some concrete takeaways, both personally and professionally. Very quickly, before we jump in, the Canadian Centre is a national charity focused on mobilizing collective action and system change to end all forms of human trafficking in Canada. And really, Centre was developed to enhance cross-sectoral collaboration with governments, the private sector, not-for-profits, as well as the Canadian public. And we really function as that backbone organization to do that, supporting cross-sectoral collaboration by sharing information and best practices, by bringing people together to reduce duplicate efforts, and really to kind of dismantle the siloed approach to addressing trafficking in Canada. We are both publicly and privately funded, and also the operators of the 24/7 National Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, developed with support from the Federal Department of Public Safety and other generous donors. Some of our work includes primary research and data collection to shine a light on the issue of trafficking. We work to educate communities, networks, service providers about the reality of this issue and to share that hotline resource. And we also work with policymakers at all levels to address the systemic issues that are impacting trafficking and advocating for service provision and funding to bring forward real change. So what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is a criminal activity in which people are forced, coerced, or deceived into an exploitative situation for another person's gain. So in Canada, anyone involved in the receiving, the harboring, the transporting, the obtaining of a person for the purpose of exploitation has committed a trafficking offense. Human trafficking is often described as a crime that is hidden in plain sight because victims and traffickers don't always outwardly appear in the ways in which television or pop culture tell us that they do. The unfortunate reality is, in fact, that pop culture depictions of human trafficking often do more harm than good and may misrepresent how this is really occurring in our communities. A little later on, I will take you through some of the common misperceptions about human trafficking. But really in Canada, we see two main forms of human trafficking, which are sex and labor trafficking. Some of our early data around the hotline reported cases identifies that 71% of all reported cases to the hotline were identified as sex trafficking, followed by labor trafficking at 7%. And approximately 20% of cases were identified as not specified, and that's really when someone calls the hotline without specifying the nature of their trafficking situation. But what's the important takeaway here is we really believe that labor trafficking is quite underrepresented in our current data set and is certainly vastly underreported in the data set collected by Statistics Canada at the federal level. And we know that migrant workers in particular are a difficult population to reach due to the fact that they are often in secluded rural areas, may not have ready access to the internet, as well as language and cultural barriers. Human trafficking is identified in two places in Canada. First, it is a criminal code offence in the Canadian Criminal Code, as well as identified in the Immigration, Refugee and Protection Act. The criminal code understanding of the crime of human trafficking has three main elements. So on the right, you'll see the act, which is what is done by the trafficker. And so any one of the listed activities in the red box are criminal acts as it relates to trafficking. And then in the middle there, you'll see the means. So this is the part of the trafficking activity that identifies how a person was trafficked and exploited. Did the trafficker use physical force or violence, coercion, threats, lies to lure someone into that trafficking situation? And then what are the actions that they took to keep that person stuck, keep them in the trafficking situation? And then the final element speaks to the reason or the purpose for the exploitation, which is most often for financial gain in forced commercial sexual activity or forced labor and services. What's important here, the takeaway is that only one element from the act means purpose model here is required to substantiate a human trafficking claim. However, in reality, things are far more complex and unfortunately not so black and white. Unfortunately, we often see the terms trafficking and smuggling used interchangeably, but they are in fact two very distinct things. So again, before we kind of jump into the meat about what human trafficking is, we need to talk about what trafficking is not. And so while you can see on the left side, trafficking is a crime against a person, where smuggling is really a crime against a nation's border. Trafficking is based on exploitation, smuggling is based on transportation. And trafficking does not require movement or a border to be crossed, whereas smuggling really requires that border crossing element. But the takeaway here really is that individuals who are smuggled into a country then become more at risk for trafficking because they often don't have status within that country, and that's a risk factor there. So according to estimates from the International Labour Organization in Geneva, in 2021, there were an estimated 50 million people, including men, women, and children, who were victims of trafficking. Of these 50 million, 28 million were in forced labor and 22 million were trapped in forced marriages. Trafficking in human beings is not like any other crime. It really feeds off economic and gender inequalities and weak institutional policies. Unfortunately, the estimates are trending in the wrong direction, and we know that COVID-19 has only exacerbated the issue as the social fabric, our sense of connectedness, and the supporting institutions have frayed over the last 3 years. In the updated 2021 estimates, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe noticed an increase in reporting of other forms of exploitation, specifically trafficking for forced criminality, which went from about 2% to 24% globally within 5 years. And the European Union also reported that it is seeing an increase in cases in the cannabis industry, forced begging, and increases of reporting of forced marriages or sham marriages globally too. And in 2021, 31% of reporting countries surveyed identified an increase of cases of trafficking of persons with disability. And so, the global context for this conversation is important because many people mistakenly think that human trafficking only takes place overseas or that it only impacts non-citizens. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about the myths and misperceptions about human trafficking and why that is not correct. So on this slide, I'm going to take you through some commonly held misperceptions about trafficking in Canada. And it's important to debunk these really early on in today's training so that your foundation of knowledge is grounded in the reality of the Canadian context. So on the top there, you'll see myth number 1 is that human trafficking only involves foreign nationals being brought into Canada. And while foreign nationals, often migrant workers, are trafficked into and can also be trafficked once they arrive here to work in Canada, it's important to note that Canadian citizens and permanent residents are also targeted for trafficking. Many people mistakenly think that human trafficking is only a big city problem, but we know that police reported cases of trafficking in Canada tend to be concentrated in urban centers, but we know that human trafficking happens in Canadian communities, both big and small, urban and rural, where there is an investment in dedicated education, awareness, and resources for all stakeholders usually means high rates of identification also follow. Myth number 3 is that sex trafficking starts with kidnapping or that traffickers target people they don't know. And while this can happen, most of the time traffickers know their victim and may have a romantic relationship with them, maybe a family member, maybe a friend, or may have an employer-employee relationship with the victim. Number 4, only women and girls are targeted for sex trafficking. Again, this is not true. Men and boys can be victims of trafficking, and we know that gender diverse and transgender people are being exploited and trafficked at incredibly high rates compared to their overall population size. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but trafficking does not require movement. Traffickers do utilize movement to keep victims controlled and disoriented, but many survivors report being trafficked within their own communities or within their own homes. Number 6, trafficked persons are held against their will and unable to leave their situation. And again, while this can happen, and we know that oftentimes victims of trafficking on the outside may appear to have the appearance of freedom of movement and control over their person and their belongings, but in fact they are being psychologically controlled and manipulated with lies and threats. And so those bonds are actually more psychological in nature, not physical. And finally, myth number 7, that all commercial sex is human trafficking. Again, this is not true. People choose to engage in sex work for a variety of reasons, whereas trafficking involves coercion, manipulation, control, violence, and a lack of choice. So let's talk about the risk factors that make a person more likely to be targeted by a trafficker. As you can see on this slide, there are a number of individual and societal factors that make a person more at risk of being targeted. For example, Black, Indigenous people of color are targeted at higher rates than other groups. Foreign nationals, especially those without status, are targeted for trafficking. Young people experiencing marginalization of some kind, such as poverty, homelessness, mental health struggles, addictions, or involvement in the child welfare or justice systems are also at risk. Other at-risk individuals include individuals who are newcomers, so maybe they don't speak English, young people searching for belonging or validation online, and then folks from equity-seeking groups who have already experienced pervasive systemic discrimination. Again, maybe easier for traffickers to disempower and control than other groups. It's important to note that traffickers rarely target people who are empowered, who have a supportive community, and who have all of their basic needs met. If you have a safe home, a supportive community, and healthy options, you likely won't be an easy target for trafficking. Instead, traffickers look for people who, due to their life circumstance, socioeconomic location, or other systemic factors, are just easier targets. Across all of the cases reported to the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline in its first year, we found that a staggering 90% of victims and survivors identified as female. The center's data also found that it's not just women and girls who are disproportionately targeted by trafficking. The data shows us that transgender men, women, and gender diverse individuals are victimized at much higher rates relative to their population size. While this group comprises approximately 0.24% of our total population, they represented 2% of all cases that were documented to the hotline in year one. So we know that this means that the victimization rate amongst this group is nearly 8 times higher than what you might expect if you were just looking at their share of the population. Traffickers are also incredibly opportunistic, and they will use a variety of recruitment methods and locations to target potential victims. Recruitment can come in the form of fake job ads. Often we're seeing it happen via social media. We know that there's peer-to-peer recruitment happening in schools, in shelters, other institutions. Again, we also know that female-to-female recruitment is especially challenging and complex to tease apart, as most often in these specific scenarios, a young person who was once a trafficking victim becomes a recruiter on behalf of the trafficker as a means of survival. Human trafficking does not impact everyone equally. However, we know intuitively that traffickers target those who've historically been marginalized. Evidence has found that victims are disproportionately more likely to come from Indigenous, Black, 2S LGBTQIA+, and migrant communities, and yet this reality still isn't well understood in Canada. In addition to experiencing higher rates of personal trauma, these groups face broader systemic issues that have helped foster distrust of our institutions. And within this context, they may hesitate to seek help from these institutions for fear of being re-victimized. And unfortunately, it's this reluctance to identify which has led to fewer officially reported trafficking cases and has created a situation where these marginalized or equity-seeking groups are invisible in our current data sets that are really used to guide policymaking and resource allocation. And so really the reality is that eliminating human trafficking then becomes very difficult if decision makers aren't able to see the full picture. As a national backbone organization, we are looking at the ways that we can partner across sectors to strengthen the safety net for victims and survivors of trafficking. And so some of the items that are required to improve Canada's response to trafficking are trauma-informed tailored services that are funded in perpetuity for survivors, cross-jurisdictional responses and strategies in every province and territory, improved communication amongst various stakeholders, governments, their entities, and agencies. And really, we need to look holistically at the underlying social factors that are contributing to trafficking for both victims and perpetrators. And we really need to shift our focus on prevention efforts. Finally, increased training for judges, crown prosecutors, and law enforcement will allow survivors to have better outcomes. How is the center responding to these challenges and opportunities? So we are working with various governments to inform legislation and policy development. We work closely with survivor leaders and lived experience experts to do primary research to help fill those knowledge gaps. We're doing targeted outreach and awareness and education campaigns on sex and labor trafficking to the general public, but also to targeted groups. We do education awareness sessions such as this one across sectors to shine light on the issue of trafficking, and we work closely with our partner hotlines in the US and Mexico to share information and best practices.